Welcome back. In this chapter, we know we need a tool to manage our builds. And you know by now, of course, that tool is going to be Jenkins. Well, a little bit as with the configuration management software when we chose Ansible, there are a lot of these continuous integration tools available. It really is an absolutely enormous list. The one that really broke through years ago was one that I think originally came from ThoughtWorks, and that was called Cruise Control back in 2001. That was the tool that really established continuous integration as a viable technique. I don't know why it sort of fell by the wayside a bit. In fact, it hasn't been released for a number of years now. On the Java side of things, at least, the dominant tool, I think anyway, is called Jenkins. You may have heard of an earlier tool called Hudson, and it's really the same tool. Jenkins was a fork of Hudson. There was a political problem, as always, with Oracle. So Jenkins is the tool we're working with, and of course by this point on the course you will have already written yourself an Ansible script to install Jenkins. So as usual, we'll need to start our Ansible node. Up until this point, we've been constantly starting and terminating the Jenkins instance. But this time around, for the first time now, we're going to run our Ansible playbook that is going to provision the EC2 instance for Jenkins. I guess actually it would be worth renaming that script now. Earlier on in the course, we were experimenting with EC2 instances, but now this is specifically to, I guess, let's call it create Jenkins instance.yaml. And you will find the completed version of this script in your practicals and code folder. I will need to remember, of course, to do my SSH agent bash and the SSH add. Now, you're probably bored of me repeating this, but I realise some of you will be returning to this part of the course after a long absence. And of course, I am going to need to set up my environment variables, which for safety I'm going to do off camera. And if you're in any doubt about how to do that, you can check out the documents in the practicals and code folder that runs through all of those steps. Anyway, on to the interesting part of this course. I've just realised that we had an earlier script called install Jenkins, which was a basic script that doesn't do any EC2 provisioning. And that's going to be really confusing now. So I'm going to remove that script because the create Jenkins instance playbook, and I'm still not getting access. And I think that's because, and I will leave this in the video to remind you that if you decided to take the very safe option of making the deployment policy that we've created, I'll click through to that. We've restricted it to a particular IP address, so I will need to edit that and change the IP address to be the IP address of my Ansible control node. Now, you might not know this because I missed it from early versions of the video when we originally did this work, but it keeps old versions of this policy document, and for some bizarre reason, it only lets you keep 5 earlier versions. So eventually, if I do a couple of fake edits here, eventually you get this error saying we can only have up to 5 versions of this. So it's pretty annoying that you have to go into the policy versions here, delete the old versions, and then you should be able to safely update this IP address. Eventually, we will get to the point where we talk about Jenkins. Create Jenkins instance.yaml. Okay, so we have a new instance. Just to confirm in the console, there's our new Jenkins server. And as we've done previously, we can visit that IP address on port 8080. Now, this is as far as we've got previously. We have to first of all unlock Jenkins. And as we're being advised here, we'll find this via a file on the server. This, of course, means on the Jenkins server under this particular directory. I think I'll take a copy of that directory. There's 2 ways we could do this. We could go and log in using SSH onto that server and then we could go hunting around for the password. Which I don't know about you, sounds a little bit tedious. I'd like to avoid having to SSH into really any of the instances that we create on this course. So I suggest that we do this step of extracting the password as part of the Ansible playbook. We can do that quite elegantly. Let's edit the create Jenkins instance script. And I think right down at the bottom, after we've done the starting up of Jenkins, we can write a task which we'll label as get the initial password. And I'm going to use a module here called fetch. I think this is the first time we've used this Ansible module. Check the documentation if you're interested. This allows us to fetch a file from the remote server. And it's a simple case of specifying the name of the source file that we want to download. And I can paste in that path name that I just copied off the Jenkins node. And then we specify a destination that we want to write that file into. And that means on our Ansible control instance. So I'm going to just create a file called ./Jenkins password. I suppose I could call it .txt, doesn't really matter. There is one other flag that we need to set because I think by default it will preserve the directory structure of the original file, which we really don't want. So there's a setting called flat, which I'll set to yes, and that will get rid of the directory structure. So we should end up with just a single file called jenkinspassword.txt. Now, if we run this, this will now work, but I have experienced some problems with this script when I run it for the first time, and then it only works if you run it again. And it's become obvious to me now, just as I'm recording, that that's probably because, although this step is starting up Jenkins, it will of course run onwards, and it will try to get this initial password before Jenkins has finished starting up. So I think you know how to solve that problem. You'll remember that we have a task that allows us to wait, in this case for Jenkins to start. The task name is called wait_for, and we tell it which port we're waiting on. This is 8080 for us, and I think it's the default, but the state will be started. Now, because I think that the source directory here is a protected directory, as often the case, we will need a become yes as well, so that this is executed under sudo. If you don't have that, then this task will just silently do nothing and you will get green text. So let's give that a try. That looks good. It says there's been a change, and I have a file there which I can output using cat, and there is my temporary password. It's safe for me to put this in the recording because I will have destroyed this instance by the time you see this anyway. Now, before I go on, you don't need to follow along with this step, but I just want to prove that that pause actually worked. So just for illustration, I'm going to terminate my Jenkins server. You don't need to do this. This will be a bit wasteful, but I want to run that script again and make sure that we are still... Well, I'm glad I did that because I've uncovered a problem with the playbook now. Even though I have a completely fresh server here, which will have a new password generated, can you see that on the getting that initial password, it's saying nothing changed? Of course, the old Jenkins password.txt file already exists, which is a bit annoying because we know that file has changed and we do want it to be refreshed. The first port of call should be the Ansible docs, and I would have expected in here to be some kind of an option to say overwrite file or something like that, but certainly at the time of recording, there's no such option. I'm an Ansible expert that might know a better way of doing this, but I would suggest, so even though you don't need to follow along with me with killing your instance, do follow on by adding in a new task. What we're going to do at the start of this script, before anything else, is we're going to delete that file locally if it exists. Then we're going to make this the first task that we do as part of the localhost part of the script. So we'll just call this delete existing password file. And there's a module called file, and the documentation for it is here. And we can do a lot with this module, but what we're looking for is we'll supply a path to the file and we'll supply a state of absence. So that looks pretty simple. So the path is going to be ./Jenkins password.txt and the state will be absent. Now this does mean that every time we run this script, even if nothing has changed, it will always delete and refetch the file, but that's okay. So let's give that a check. So this time that task is indicating there was a change. And of course I memorized the previous password and I can see that this one is now different. I know this is a bit tedious, but just to be absolutely sure that everything's okay, again, don't follow along with this step, but I'm going to terminate the server, run that playbook again, and I want to check that we do get that password file the first time we run the script. Oh, well, this isn't going very well. You can see that even with that waiting, I'm still getting the green on getting the initial password. However, I bet if I run the script again, you can see that it does have a change here. So I think all that's happening is that this password is being created by Jenkins kind of late on in its startup cycle. So we have a bit of a race condition. Now, I don't want to get hung up on this. I'm getting fed up of hacking these Ansible scripts. I've discovered with a little bit of experimentation that on this wait for, I realise this isn't very nice, but I'm going to put in a delay here of some number of seconds. I've discovered that 30 is sufficient. You might want to try experimenting with shorter delays. And that does seem to give Jenkins time to generate this password. If that doesn't work for you, it really doesn't matter. You just run the script again and then you will get the password. I'm sorry I've spent far too long on that, but now at least you should have a file called jenkinspassword.txt. And going back to your Jenkins console, if you've been spending a while, you may find that your session will have expired here. So it's well worth doing a refresh here before pasting in your password. And you should now be presented with the customized Jenkins screen. Jenkins relies heavily on plugins. And over the next few chapters, we're going to be adding lots of plugins to the Jenkins installation. However, you do need a base set of plugins as well. And if you click on the Install Suggested Plugins, you'll see on the next screen that there's quite a lot of plugins being installed here. We won't need them all. We will certainly need the Git plugin. We will certainly need the email extension plugin. There's some that we won't need, but there's no harm in including them. Just wait for this to complete. Okay, well, I must have done this 100 times in the past, but for me, just off camera then, one of the plugins failed to install. It didn't seem to give me a chance to reattempt the installation, so I have a feeling this recording's going quite badly. Never mind, I just decided to trash the installation. I terminated the instance and ran the Ansible script again. If that happens to you, you can do the same. Anyway, the first task is to create yourself an admin user. The password we just used previously is a one-use throwaway password. So create yourself a user account here. I'm going to be called RAC. It doesn't really matter what you put in here as long as you remember your username and password. Save and finish. And at last, we're ready to start using Jenkins. So we're on the front page now of Jenkins, and where on earth do we start? Well, the obvious place is to create some jobs. And what we're going to do in here is we're going to create a project for one of our repositories. And we'll see how all of that works. And the end goal of this section of the course is I want to be able to automatically point Jenkins at all of the repositories for all of our microservices and web applications and all the rest of it with the minimal amount of work. However, before we get there, we are going to do things manually and click around and get some familiarity with Jenkins first. So our starting point is we're going to create what's called a freestyle project. Well, it claims that this is the central feature of Jenkins. What it really means is this is the most basic way of working with Jenkins. It's very manual, and we are going to have to work with the graphical user interface. A little later in this course, I can't wait to show you the pipeline, which gives us a very powerful way of automating Jenkins. And I'm also going to show you how to work with GitHub organizations. But for now, we're going to create a project, a freestyle project, and we'll make this be, it doesn't really matter. We've got several repositories to work with on this project. I'm suggesting, just as a random example, that we make this project be based around the Fleetman position tracker that were created in the Spring Boot Microservices course. So click on OK. And now we have a long wizard where we're going to be able to configure the details of this project. Now we're going to need to point Jenkins at a Git repository. Now you might remember from the microservices course that I do have a GitHub repository. You can find it at the URL that I'm popping up on the screen now. And in there I have all of the repositories needed for this system. We have the Fleetman registry, which is the Eureka server. We've got the position tracker, which is the microservice, the position simulator that we use to generate some data for the system, and so on. Now, we can build any of these repositories, but the problem is I want you to be able to make changes to the repository, and we want to see what effect that has on the builds. And of course, you don't have write access to my repository. So you need to somehow get yourself a Git repository which is accessible remotely. By far the easiest way of doing that is for you to go to your GitHub account. If you don't have a GitHub account, then please create one. It's a good thing to have a GitHub account as a developer anyway. And I won't show you how to create one because it's absolutely trivial. You will need to verify your email before you're allowed to do anything with your account. But what I've got here is I've got a completely clean GitHub account that I've created under a new email address. And the name of this account is VPP Course User. Get yourself into the position where you have a GitHub account that you can work with. And I'm going to suggest that you simply fork my repositories. Now, I realize that you may have got some code that you've developed for yourself in the microservices course that you'd like to use. I will let you deal with the details of creating your own repositories, and you would have to push to them using Git. But if you want to do this in the easiest possible way, and you want to have the same code as me, what you can do now is, now that you're logged into GitHub, if you follow the URL of my first repository, and the URL is the URL that I'm now popping up on a title on the screen. Just visit that link in your browser bar as usual. And what you can now do is you can click on the fork button up here on the top right. It will take a few moments to do that. And the point of doing that is you now have your own repository called Fleetman Position Tracker that you can push to. And you can do basically anything you want with. Now, I know it's tedious, but you're going to need to do that for all of the other repositories as well. So if you can stand to do this, I'm going to go back in my browser. So I'm back on the page now where you're on my repository, Dick Chesterwood. Follow the link there to Dick Chesterwood, and you can see all of my repositories here. So you need to take a fork of all of them. So let's do them in turn. The Fleetman Position Simulator, follow that link and click on fork. That's done. Then go back. You'll need to go back twice. We're going to need the Fleetman web app. And then back again. We need the Fleetman registry. That's the Eureka project. Back again. We've got the Fleetman global config. This page is only showing me the latest 6 repositories. So if I click the repositories link here, I can continue. The Jenkins monitor proxy is not relevant for this course. It's basically all of the ones starting Fleetman. We also need Fleetman global config server. You did previously clone Fleetman global config, which is a separate repository. So let's get that one. And now you can go back to your account either by clicking the link here, or you could just go back to github.com. And you should now have, I think, 6 repositories which form the architecture of this system. Whew, right, good. Okay, so you've got that now. And in this chapter, we're going to be building, using Jenkins, the Fleetman position tracker. Every repository has a URL in GitHub, and the structure of it will be github.com/your username, followed by / and then the name of the repository. We need to take a copy of that, and we'll be using that in configuring Jenkins. So let's run through this. It looks like there's a lot of things to fill in here, but most of them we can leave blank. A description's worthwhile. This is the first microservice for this system. And from the options here, this is a GitHub project. If you tick this box and paste in the URL of your repository, your version of this repository, it will give you some useful links to that repository from here within Jenkins. I don't think we need anything in there. We're now in the source code management system. Click on Git, and you need the repository of the URL in here. Now, Jenkins is going to need to be able to log into this repository, so we're going to need to supply the credentials. This is just your GitHub username and password. If you drop this link down here, you'll see there's nothing in there. And what we're able to do in Jenkins is we're able to create a set of credentials, which is a set of logins. We're going to need several logins as we go through this course, but for now, click on Add and select Jenkins. As always, I should say that I bet the user interface changes a lot over time, so I hope you're able to find your way through this, even if what you're seeing is a bit different to me. This is quite simple. You're just looking here for your GitHub username, which for me is VPP course user, and your password. And this ID and login is going to be what appears within Jenkins. I'm just going to put in here GitHub and GitHub. And when we click on Add, you can now see that I can drop this credentials down, and the GitHub there is just a useful way of remembering, oh yes, these are my GitHub credentials. So select that. And you can see it looks like we have a bit of a problem already. We have an error here saying it can't connect to the repository. There's an error performing the command. Let's not worry about that just yet. We'll come back to that. Going a little further down, if we have branches, then we could specify the branch that we're building here, but we're always going to be building the master branch. Therefore, there's nothing to change here. We can specify various build triggers, and we're going to come back to that in a later chapter. You can, for example, build periodically. Maybe build the project every hour, every day. But we really want this to be built automatically every time there's a push. So we'll come back to that. We don't need anything on the build environment. And we get now to the important bit, I guess. The build section is where we tell Jenkins, how do we want to build this project? Now, although that's the important bit, I'm not going to do anything in there just for now. I'm going to go straight to save, because I'd like to see if the first step is successfully done. The first step would be the checking out of the code from the repository. So let's see if that works. I suspect it's not going to work because we saw there was an error on the configuration. Maybe you can spot what that problem is. Before we get there, I think as a Jenkins user, the thing to get used to is the structure of the user interface and the windows. What we're on here is we're on the page specifically for this particular project, the position tracker. And I can configure the project here, I can delete the project, I can do various things specifically related to that project. Notice I can also, this is really handy, I can follow the link here, and that will take me to the repository for this project. So let's go back. But if I click this back up to the dashboard, this takes me to the top level view on Jenkins, and this is where I can see all of my projects. For every one of our projects, we have a status line, and the first icon here is showing the current status of the build. There will be colors appearing here. If this were a blue icon, that would denote that the build has successfully built. If it's red, it means there was a failure. It's currently coloured grey because we've never built this project. And then this is a little bit cute. There is a weather icon, a weather report. And this is showing you what the sort of trend of the build has been. If all of the recent builds have been successful, then we'll get sunny weather. But if for any reason an earlier build failed, let's say 1 out of the last 5 builds has failed, then we'll see storm clouds appearing there. Well, none of our recent builds have failed because we haven't done any, so we currently have sunny weather. I think it's a fairly safe bet that we're going to be seeing a lot of rainy weather in there, at least while we're getting started. Anyway, over on the far right hand side is the icon that we're looking for. This icon is the Build Now icon, and it will run a build. Let's give it a try. So when you run a build, they're all run on threads, and these threads in Jenkins are called executors. You can think of it as being a bit like an execution queue. Now, I got a bit confused there, and I had to stop the recording because actually when I'm pressing Build Now, usually I would expect to see on here the build executing, and I can click a link from here to watch the progress of that build while it's running. And I thought something was broken because I'm certainly not seeing anything on there, no matter how many times I click this. And perhaps you're not seeing anything there either. But you can see, I've actually done a refresh, you can see that I'm now seeing a red icon here and stormy weather. So clearly the build's failing. I think all that's happening is because it's failing very quickly, it seems to be taking about 32 milliseconds. There just simply isn't time for it to appear on the build executor. It's just too quick. So to find out what's gone on, we can click through to the project. And what we have down at the bottom left here is the history of all of the builds of this project. So you should see at least one in here. I've obviously been clicking quite a lot. You can click the link to the latest build at the top of the list. And this gives us all of the details of exactly what happened in that build. The most useful link, I think, is the console output here. And by clicking through to this is going to show you exactly what happened in the background with that build. And you can see a very quick failure. There's a stack trace here. And if you look through it, it's saying it cannot run the program Git. Now you'll remember that we had an error or a warning when we were setting up this build. And it's for the same reason. It's simply that we need to install Git on this Jenkins server. There's 2 ways we can do that. I'm going to show you the way that I don't think is a good way. But if I go back all the way up to the initial dashboard, I can click on Manage Jenkins here. And there is a link for global tool configuration. You can see here there's a link to Git installations. And the traditional way of working with Jenkins is that we would go into here and we would add a Git installation, and we can click on Add Automatically and all the rest of it. Well, I'm not going to recommend that we do that because that's doing things manually. And it would mean that every time we create a new Jenkins instance, we would have to remember to do this. It would make much better sense if we did this as part of the Ansible playbook that we used to initially generate this instance. Now, before long, I'm going to start giving you these Ansible playbooks, but I'm not going to bother with this one because it's a simple step. If we go back to the playbook and we'll add right to the bottom another task, which we'll call Install Git. You know how to do this now. It's going to be the yum, and the name is Git. Git is always part of yum repositories, and we're looking for the state of latest. We'll need to be super user, so become yes. Get these 3 lines into your playbook. And of course, this playbook won't take long to run because most of this has already been done. So that's great. Install Git has worked successfully. Can I just draw your attention to the fact that the getting the initial password has gone through as green. And if I do an ls, I can no longer see that Jenkins password. I hope that's not too surprising to you. Remember, it's a one-shot password. And now that we've logged in with that password, it's now being used and it's simply not available on the server anymore. So the getting the initial password is silently completing. So that's interesting, but the important thing is we now have Git installed. And back here on the server, we don't have to do anything special, I don't think. We can go back to the dashboard and we can run our build again. And there is a difference this time. I'm going to pause that there. I am now seeing the build executor. It still ran through pretty quickly. I didn't get a chance to click the link, but I can refresh this page. And now I'm seeing a blue circle here. I hope you are too. Slightly annoying with Jenkins at the time of recording, at least. I bet this gets improved over time, but there's a lot of Ajax type stuff going on here, like the build executor, which is really neat. But then there are some elements that are not Ajax, and you've got to do a manual refresh. So, because I thought at first, oh no, this build hasn't succeeded. There is an enable auto refresh button here on the top right, which is okay. I find it can be a bit annoying because it does quite a hard refresh. I think I'll switch this on, and if it gets annoying, I'll switch it back off again. Don't worry that the weather looks bad. That just means that 4 out of the last 5 builds failed. When we start getting good clean builds, eventually the weather will improve. But if we follow the link to the position tracker, there's my successful build, which for me is build 6. I'm clicking the link there, and now onto the console output, I can see a rather bewildering list of Git operations going on here. It does look like it's doing a checkout, so that's absolutely great. Now, what's happening here is that the project is being checked out to the Jenkins machine, and it's created a folder somewhere on the machine. Yeah, that refresh is getting annoying, so I'm going to disable it. There is a link here to the workspace, and clicking to that shows you, this is fantastic. We can see here what is actually the entire project source code. So let's have a look in SRC. There's definitely all of our code. So that can sometimes be useful. But of course, the important thing we want to do now is actually build this so that we run the tests and we create either a WAR file or a jar file. Time for a break though. First, rejoin me in the next chapter and we'll get this full build implemented.